Hello, my name is John Monroe, and I'm going to talk about Windrush Gardens today, and which are here at Burden and part of the Rural Life Museum. And I have to talk about a little bit about the Burden family who lived here, because the gardens were designed for what they wanted and to express themselves in the way they wanted to live. They grew up, moved here in 1920, and lived here. That's when the beginning of the gardens happened. They lived in this house behind me, and the gardens were added to add to their living experience. There were 3 children, I own Pike and Steele, who made the donation of all this property that we have to Louisiana State University. And more significantly, though, was one of them was Steele Burden, who was really the artist of the family, and he was the one who developed and designed and implemented and maintained these gardens really all his life. It was influenced by circumstances that many gardens you might see don't have to deal with, and that was lack of resources. I'm going to mention that as we go through here in more detail, but it influenced everything that he did. As I said, he was an artist, and he worked in many mediums, but landscape design was the one I think he is most known for. One thing, even though what you see here reminds you of sort of the old antebellum South, that is not how these gardens were not developed during that period of time. They're definitely 20th century gardens that began at sometime around 1920 and continued their development until Steele's death in 1995. So they're 20th century gardens, but with an old garden feel to them that you will see as we go through this. One more thing that I should itemize was the limitations that influenced what he did here. And one of them primarily was lack of resources. He'd really only had maybe a couple of people to help him a couple of days a week most of the time. And so what he did was, and the plants he selected and used and kept were influenced by these limitations. All right, we're here by the lily pond. This was the first project that Steele did. It's behind the old Burden house, which is right behind. We're standing right behind here, and it would have been done sometime in the 1920s when he was a 20-year-old man. There's many of the features that he used in garden design, and I'll point some out here. If you look around, you'll see that every garden bed was edged, in this case with mucky grass. He always edged the space with either mucky grass or laurel. And there was a reason for that, and that was that he was interested in maintaining the shape of the lawn area, which was the first design element that he worked on. And he could do that by maintaining this edge. And if you had a little problem with some weeds growing up behind it, it didn't change that image. It didn't change it. And so he was able to everything he did was edged with monkey grass or lariat for that reason. And of course, he was very fond of sculpture. This piece here, he thought was maybe the earliest piece of sculpture in downtown Baton Rouge at that time. It was owned by an uncle, William Pike, who was a big business developer in Baton Rouge and New Orleans at that time. And here it is. It's been saved. We'll see the use of sculpture and other hard features throughout our tour of the garden today. What was put in the beds, the second step he would use would be placement of the trees. In this case, we have crepe myrtles. They're behind you now, but you see them all here as well, which are the trees that were used to amplify this. After that, the beds were just filled in with things that worked. And of course, the ubiquitous azalea plant became one of his favorite things to use, even though he was unhappy that the bloom didn't last longer, but they're a nice foliage plant. And they survived. At the time he was working, there was one water line, a small pipe that ran throughout the gardens, and during the hot summers, he had to drag hoses around to keep them alive. And so if they didn't take care of themselves pretty much, they soon lost a place on his design palette. I would like to mention this too. He's often said to be a native gardener. Well, he wasn't, but he was one who picked plants that naturalized well. Azalea is not a native plant to Louisiana. Crepe myrtle is not a native plant, but they adapt quite well. Other things that are on his list, and you can see a couple of them here and there, are the Nandina and Ardesia, which are kind of large ground covers, really. They get these red berries in the winter and make the winter garden here almost, well, I believe it is as attractive as any other season that we have. We have the lily pond, and back, if you can see, the garden house. We can move back there and take a look at that spot as well. Okay, this is another great spot. It was developed about the same time as the lily pond to demonstrate Steele's landscape technique. It's back by the garden house here. The garden house has a history. It was built after they had moved here in the 1920s, and his father built the main section of this house. Later on, Steele added a little extension, which was the bathroom. He spent a lot of time out here on his work, on his art, and entertaining. And if you saw the arch, this is something he picked up with it that he saw on his travels to Europe. He did extensive travels to France and Italy and England, and was impressed by the emotions that he felt as he went through these beautiful places. And his goal in developing Windrush Gardens was to recreate the same feelings that he had when he was there. And because he lived in the garden to a large extent, this little house was a little like an extra room for him and the family. You will also see over here one of the original structures that were here long before the Burdens moved back. which is we call the hostler's house. It was an original structure that probably dates back to mid-1800s. We don't know exactly what the time is. You will also see something that Steele liked to do, and that is the pigeonniere, which is a more recent, relatively recent construction in that, but it was representative. A lot of old plantations or old farms had pigeonnieres. They grew pigeons to eat. They were called squaw, a little fancier name. This one never grew any pigeons. It was in as a garden, built as a garden home, and he had that done. You will notice that in Windrush Gardens, the spots picked for ornamentals like annuals and things like that are selected carefully, but not to be just fields of color, because the maintenance required to take care of them was too much, and so they were used for places where you had something like a pigeonniere or a piece of sculpture that you wanted to enhance. Okay, we're standing here by a live oak tree. The live oak was one of his favorite trees, mostly because of its longevity. But there's a story about that and his mother, Miss Ollie, who wanted him to plant live oaks all along the lane coming in here. He was still a young man and didn't understand why they needed to worry about live oaks, since none of them would have lived to see them reach maturity. And Miss Ollie told Steele, well, we're not planting these trees for ourselves, which is what I think was where the influence came for all the children to think about the people that were going to come along and enjoy the world they helped create after they were gone. Because this tree now has grown. When a garden was originally laid out and planted, it would have had a lot more sun than it has now. And as the trees have grown over them, it's converted most of these areas into what Steele called a shade garden. And the shade garden is not an ideal place for growing flowering things, which was fine with them because of the maintenance. But they become more interested in the way the plants are mixed together. The composition of contrasting textures and shades of green makes an interesting garden appearance, and you can see that here, where we have the small leaf boxwoods and azaleas, something a little larger in the camellia, and then even larger in like elephant ears and plants in the background, and all different colors of green that make for an interesting composition. It was done by design. We had talked about the help that he had. I think maybe this is a good time to mention another man. His name was George Raby, who moved here in the late 30s or 1940 to help the Burdens run the place. He lived in a little cabin back in the field, and eventually ended up working for Pike in his printing business, but also was a landscape maintenance helper for Steele in his continuing development of Windrush Gardens. He was a critical contributor to what you see here today. George Raby needs to be mentioned. Here we are in this garden room, which was developed, you would associate in time with the 1930s or so. Here again, you see the same elements that he used elsewhere. Sculpted, well-defined lawn areas, bordered by, in this case, it's all mondo grass or monkey grass, as we call it, and but with little alcoves that were designed to display pieces of sculpture that he collected and was interested in. You can see one in the background here, which is a bronze. He was a classical themes were his favorite themes for sculpture, and this happens to be Zeus and Mercury on that piece there. It's a beautiful piece. But we have other spots that the piece there looks like concrete, but it's actually a stone sculpture that he found among another 3 or 4 others when he was visiting Paris, France, and bought them and had them shipped back here. You can also see other plants that I should mention that are in here. One of the other senses he was attentive to was the sense of smell. And he liked to have aroma plants, I guess you would call them, such as gardenia, sweet olive, and butterfly ginger, and magnolia fuscata, or banana shrub, things that you could gain a sense to by your sense of smell. I can't emphasize too much that his intent was to provide an experience that evoked contemplation, was a serene, meditative experience. It's the way he lived his life, and he wanted to make it available to other people, such as now when we're now entering the garden around him. So it was designed for walks, thoughtful contemplation, and memories of the way things used to be and how they affect our life today. Other things other than sculpture, we can see a couple of old urns over here. That the entrance to the next garden room, which he collected from old Baton Rouge and used in the garden setting. Wherever there was a piece of sculpture or hard surface like an urn or a bench, he would decorate that a little more formally with a little color when he could get it in there, or maybe boxwoods, things like that are a little more formal in appearance. The rest of it was more informal in the shrubbery. One of the things you will see, and we think we give him credit for recognizing it, was in those days, the old plantations all around Louisiana had these old sugar kettles that they used to make crystalline sugar out of sugar cane, which were replaced by more modern mills, and the sugar kettles were just thrown off in the field. We think he was maybe at least one of the first to recognize the decorative and historical value of these old sugar kettles, and he used them as little fountain pieces, if you will, in his gardens. In Steele Burden's mind, one of the most important elements of Windrush Gardens was the paths that he laid out. He wanted them always to be maintained at the same spacing and distance. In other words, even though the plant's materials would change, the paths should stay the same. You can see a good example of it here on what I'm standing on and surrounding me. All right, so as we've walked south away from the old house, we've reached really the 1940s era garden room. As you can see, it's undergoing some extensive restoration right now. As you can contrast that with what we talked about before, but it's well underway, and it's just an example of how much effort has to go into taking care of this place. The development continues on to the south over to an area in the back, the lake area, which were dug in about the 50s sometimes, and Steele was still working on developing that direction when he died in 1995. Again, I would encourage you to come visit us here at Windrush Gardens.